Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of the Muslim Bitcoiner podcast. So today, actually joined by my very own brother Sal, and today we're going to be talking about Muslims adopting Bitcoin. This will be the first part of a series of podcast episodes, so we'll call this the Bitcoin Majlis series. So today we just what we're going to talk about today is we'll talk about our education-based platform, Bitcoin Majlis, and what the mission of that is. We'll also go over kind of the basics of the Bitcoin network, and we'll also talk about Bitcoin as sound money, and we'll also talk about some of the characteristics and properties of Bitcoin, and we'll also talk about how that benefits the Muslim Ummah to adopt a Bitcoin standard. So I guess just to kind of start out, so this before we start talking about Bitcoin Majlis, I wanted to just to kind of talk about the problem, and this is something that I've talked about on my Twitter account quite a bit, is that we've noticed as I've kind of started to learn about Bitcoin and as I've started to look online for resources from Muslims that have talked about Bitcoin, there's kind of this lack of dialogue that's around Bitcoin, and it just seems like whenever Bitcoin is mentioned, it's always talked about very superficially, and it's never really talked about from a sound money perspective. So even whenever a scholar issues a fatwa calling Bitcoin halal or haram, it's never done in a very holistic way, and it's just kind of looked at it as an investment vehicle and not so much as a sound money. And even when talking about Bitcoin, it's never very clear whether Muslims that are talking about it understand how the current fiat system operates, with riba operating at its base layer. So, that was kind of the motivation for us starting. And I would say, like, one example of this kind of lack of dialogue happening is, there was this podcast episode that was done by, I think it was Islamic finance guru, where they actually brought Nu'man Ali Khan, and there was also Mufti Faraz Adam, and there was another person on there. But the episode was about Bitcoin. And, when I first saw this, when it came out, I was very excited because I was like, oh, wow, Nu'man Ali Khan is actually going to learn about Bitcoin. So, I pulled up the episode, and, Bitcoin is only talked about for the first 5-10 minutes. And of course, there's talk about blockchain technology, but then the episode gets completely derailed, and they end up talking about Web3 and NFTs and metaverse. And it was not the podcast episode I thought it was going to be. And I got the impression that Nu'man Ali Khan probably walked away from that more confused than when it initially started. And even in that podcast episode, they didn't really even talk about fiat and how riba operates at its base layer. So, that was just one example, but when I watched that podcast episode and some other things, that's kind of like when I talked to Sal, and I was like, wow, we have to start something of our own. And that's kind of like how we got to start Bitcoin Majlis.
Yep. And after watching for a few years, you just kind of hope that, okay, someone out there will send a signal to say, okay, Muslims need to pay attention here. But maybe it's you and me that have to do it. So inshallah, we'll be able to, get the message out to more Muslims to look more in depth into Bitcoin. And yeah, so to talk a little bit about Bitcoin Majlis, that this is the initiative where we kind of just want to provide a high signal resource. So, we have on our website, bitcoinmajlis.org. And, Majlis is the Arabic word for gathering or council, but really we just kind of want it to be an initiative where it can be a place where Bitcoin is discussed without all the nonsense and confusion of the rest of the cryptocurrency space. We don't need to get bogged down into Web3. We don't need to get lost in the weeds so much. And, the other tokens that are in the cryptocurrency space are really inferior forms of money. And we'll get into that later. But just real quick about Bitcoin Majlis. It's a nonprofit organization, and we seek to educate Muslims about the halal case for Bitcoin, and as a means of kind of escaping the riba-based fiat currency systems of the world. Our mission is to provide educational resources and guidance to Muslims to adopt a Bitcoin standard. We seek to educate Muslim individuals, nonprofits, and businesses to utilize this new financial anti-riba technology. And we believe that Bitcoin is the best monetary technology to escape the riba-based systems. So, inshallah, we seek to empower the Muslim Ummah with knowledge to escape the riba-based financial system.
Yeah, and this is kind of like the main motivation for this is that we're not like trying to build a product or anything. It's just that like we noticed that the discourse around Bitcoin is just not adequate among Muslims and especially scholars. So this is just kind of a way to get out there and maybe bring some more discussion into the topic of Bitcoin among Muslims, and that's why like we're kind of really heavily focused on the education aspect of it. So.
Yeah, and we figured maybe this would be a good episode to just kind of go over the basics of what Bitcoin really is. So Bitcoin is a term that's kind of used to describe different things. There's kind of like the Bitcoin network, and then there's also the units that run on the Bitcoin network. So the Bitcoin network is a peer-to-peer network where there's no central point of control. So everything is distributed where there's no one in control of it. It's kind of like collectively everyone is running it. And it's the peers on this network, and anyone can be a peer just using a regular computer, where the peers oversee an ever-growing ledger of transactions among all the users. And the built-in units of these transactions are Bitcoins and Satoshis. And to kind of expand on that a little bit, kind of think about how, everyone's maybe familiar with the dollar having 100 cents. Bitcoin has 100 million Satoshis. So right off the bat, you can maybe already tell that Bitcoin is better money because it's highly divisible. And not just that, but it's also way more portable, way more uniform, and way more verifiable. So it's very easy to, be able to use your own computer to verify mathematically that what you indeed own is a Bitcoin without relying on any third parties. And the most important characteristic is how it is absolutely scarce. The limit is 21 million Bitcoins that are ever going to be created on the network. And people might have a misunderstanding of like saying, "Oh, okay, well, money's supposed to keep growing in size," but that's kind of the issue with the fiat system is that there's no limit to it, and to keep it growing, there has to be an ever-growing amount of debt as well. And, from an Islamic standpoint, to have a money system just based on debt, I mean, that's not really compatible with what Muslims should be using. And, maybe before Bitcoin, you could have made the case that it was what we would call darura, to have to use the system because there was no alternative. But now we have Bitcoin, so we're not going to say that that's the case anymore. If there's a way for Muslims to act in a way that's more in line with our religion, then we definitely need to explore that avenue. And we need to be proactive about this kind of thing. And most Muslims should be at the forefront of the Bitcoin revolution. It's not something where we should just take a back seat. We really should be studying it much more closely. And so going back to Bitcoin about being sound money, scarce money, it's people kind of get the impression, okay, Bitcoin can just be replicated easily, but that's actually not the case, because Bitcoin is built on something called proof of work, where enormous amount of energy has to be expended in order to make Bitcoin. And so that's the thing that cannot be easily replicated. I mean, you can copy the code and, make a tweak here and there, and then you kind of just get a new altcoin. It doesn't have, I saw this tweet today about, how it's kind of like, the rules of chess. You can say, like, everyone's familiar with the rules of chess all over the world. And, Bitcoin's a protocol. It's an internet protocol where there's a set of rules. And if you wanted to try to, play by a different set of rules, you might be able to convince, a handful of people to join you in your new game. But that's not what the majority of people are familiar with. And that's why it's, whenever you look at these other cryptocurrencies, they kind of lack the network effect that Bitcoin has. And they also lack the cumulative amount of proof of work that has gone into making all the Bitcoins. And that's kind of what you want in your money. You want money that requires a lot of work to create. You don't want money that's easy to make. That's another thing that we want to kind of establish right from the get-go. Cryptocurrencies in general are very easy to make. There's well over 25,000 different cryptocurrencies, but of course, everyone knows Bitcoin as the one that's kind of not to be confused with the rest. So other things that about Bitcoin that really are fascinating that Muslims should pay attention to is that Bitcoin transactions are done in a peer-to-peer way. Like if you're using Bitcoin properly, you're able to do a transaction from yourself to anyone else on the Bitcoin network anywhere in the world, and it can't be stopped and it can't be censored. So you're not relying on any bank, you're not relying on any company, and you're not in a position where your transaction can be censored or your funds can be frozen. And that's really powerful. I mean, we want Muslims to be in a position where, Muslims are holding the keys to their own wealth. You don't want to be in a situation where your wealth is kind of tied up in a bank, and then you get notification. Okay, you think that you've done some suspicious transaction, so now we're going to freeze your account and we're going to shut down your account, and you no longer have access to your money. And imagine if you're kind of put in that situation. That's a really terrible situation. But now if we have Bitcoin, and if you have some Bitcoin, you're not so worried about that situation, because you can say, well, if that happens, well, I have Bitcoin and my life can continue onward.
Yeah, I think that's very, very attractive proposition for Muslims in that, like you said, you don't have to worry about any financial institutions like taking your Bitcoin away or even censoring a transaction that you want to do. And I think this is actually really powerful because, I mean, if you want to like organize your, the Muslim Ummah, it doesn't even have to be like at a global scale, even if you want to organize like your local community or whatever. And if it just doesn't and you're trying to accumulate that capital to make change, and if it just so happens to clash with the financial institutions that are in charge of moving around money, well, then you have the risk of being censored or you're having your wealth be confiscated. So, I think that property is extremely attractive for Muslims that actually want to do things and actually want to make change. You kind of need a base layer of, communicating or sending that value for it to be done in a permissionless or an uncensorable way.
Absolutely. You kind of, you could talk to Muslims all over the world, and you can kind of get a sense of like, there's this, what's missing is kind of like the old days of Islam, where kind of everyone, Islam was kind of the top dog, and where the Islamic golden age, and that's when there was that was the real renaissance maybe of the world, and that's where a lot of technological advancements were made, and the reason why that could be done is because it was you had a good money system that was based on gold, where you could actually save for the future. Imagine if you're someone that, you have savings that you can actually rely on, unlike dollars, you could plan for the future better. And this is kind of one of the things that I think Bitcoin can enable, where, like the situation of the Muslims is probably not going to improve if we're still having to rely on these institutions of riba. I mean, you like imagine if you're trying to organize, and if you have an organization that gets big and successful, but you're still kind of tied to the banking system. I mean, that's kind of like your central point of failure. I mean, like if a government thinks you're getting too big, I mean, boom, right there. That's where you can target them and kind of stop any further progress. But if you're on a Bitcoin standard, then that proposition just became a whole lot harder, because you can have a setup where Muslims all over the world, are controlling their own little pockets of money, and then they're using that to interact with each other without relying on banks.
Yeah, and I think that's actually, it's kind of hard to imagine what it would be like on a Bitcoin standard. But I mean, being able to send like your money globally, like, because I like to think of the Muslim Ummah is like a global institution. I mean, it's a global community. So being able to like transact with each other seamlessly, like and frictionlessly, and without permission, done in a peer-to-peer way. I mean, that's I feel like that's really powerful because, like you said, right now, if we want to be able to organize ourselves, there's any meaningful way, there's always going to be riba that's tied at that base layer. But like Bitcoin allows you, like it gives you all of these benefits in that one, like we've already talked about, it's permissionless and it's uncensorable. But it also gives you a way for you to actually control keep the keys to your own wealth. So like, if you were to keep money in a bank account, you don't actually own that money. It's not even really money in the bank account. It's, your imaginary fiat money could get frozen at any time. And we've already seen this happen with Muslim institutions getting debanked. And it just seems like this Bitcoin thing is like a perfect way to get around that, because like you said, you don't actually have to rely on financial institutions to transact, to facilitate those transactions.
And even if the bank account doesn't get frozen or shut down, is it really a smart idea to have kind of your organization's treasury in a bank account where you're holding dollars, and over the long term your dollars are going to be debased? They're going to be worth less in the future than they are today. And with Bitcoin, this may be something that people, when they hear about Bitcoin, they hear about how volatile it is, and the price is up 10% and down 10%, or up 30% and then down 40%. It can be scary if you're just kind of like looking at the daily charts or the weekly charts, even the monthly charts. And the thing that I think Muslims need to realize is that when it comes to Bitcoin, there has to be a long-term perspective that's taken here. Long-term savings are kind of the thing that people need to focus on. It's your long-term savings that you want to keep safe from, people being able to debase or to freeze, to confiscate from you. But with Bitcoin, you have the ability to save long-term into the future. So if you kind of have, a saving strategy where you're buying a little bit on a consistent basis, whether it's, each day or each week or each month, you're buying that same amount consistently, then what you'll notice over a period of a few years and longer, it's not going to be, down in dollar terms. You're going to be up, and you're going to have savings. And this is kind of something that maybe another aspect that people don't think about or they conflate is that, with Bitcoin being money, you can use Bitcoin as money and use it as a store of value to save for the future. And that no longer means that you have to become a part-time investor to try to figure out how to keep your savings. Like, the wealth that you worked for from your job, you don't have to say, okay, I have to go put some in buying this company stock and or this basket of goods. You could just, work your job, and then whatever amount that you want to save, you save it into Bitcoin, because that's the amount that you want to have for your long-term future. And that's something that's like really powerful. And you only see it if you, zoom out on the chart and look at the price of Bitcoin over the last, 10 years. And you'll see this pattern where the price does grow. If you average it out, you'll easily see that it continues to grow, and you'll be in the green when it comes to Bitcoin if you hold it over the long term. But you can't let the short-term price swings kind of phase you. You get to a point where when you become convinced that this is the AntiRibble solution, you're not going to be so worried. Like, you'll be able, on Day of Judgment, you'll be able to say that you did your best to evade the riba-based system and all its evils, and you used something else to save for the future. So it's just really powerful.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think that's like one of actually the really cool use cases about Bitcoin that a lot of people seem to overlook, because, especially when Muslims kind of like look at Bitcoin, they just kind of see like, okay, what does it do? And you have to explain to them, well, it's being money. So like, this new Bitcoin thing is only been around for a few years, and it's trying to be money, and it's trying to monetize from zero. So like, imagine what like how that would be. I mean, if you're having this thing that's just kind of emerged, it's not going to have a steady price. It's not going to have, of course, it's going to have volatility because people are buying and selling it. So of course, it's going to have these wild price swings because like no one actually, it's just the market trying to figure out like what the actual price of this new thing is. So like, yes, you are going to have some volatility in the short term, but like I think coming out of the fiat system, we're kind of already primed to look at things in the short term. So like we look at like, it coming 10 or 20% in a day or whatever, and we're like, oh my God, this thing is so volatile. But like you said, if you look at the long term, I mean, Bitcoin goes through its highs and its lows, and that's just based off of people buying and selling things, and also has to do with other things that are happening in the market, or it's also tied with how much fiat is being pumped into the system, and so many different factors. And like, of course, there's going to be volatility. It's not like the only way to make the Bitcoin price stable in terms of dollars is if you were censoring people to not buy and sell it. Like that would be the only way to like fix that price. So, I think that's a really good way to frame it whenever you're looking at the volatility is, you have to look at it over the long term. And also like you said, I mean, to me, this just seems like the perfect asset to save in that's anti-riba, or I should say free from riba. And, I think that's a worthy goal. Like, you don't advocate anyone getting into Bitcoin to trade it or, like trade in futures or anything. Like you work, you earn income, and whatever that you don't use, you just save it in Bitcoin. And the thing about saving in Bitcoin is that, like we've said, that you actually control the keys to. And now what's nice that you're saving in Bitcoin as Muslims, what do we do when we save? We end up paying zakat on it. So that's good. You end up paying more zakat because you have more savings. And I feel like this Bitcoin thing is kind of, at least in our little own like Muslim Bitcoiner circle, it's kind of like, I feel like I don't want to say it's like reviving zakat because like zakat is already there, but you definitely see this push of like, all right, we're saving like heck in this Bitcoin thing, and we have to pay our zakat on it, which is good because when you pay zakat, you're purifying your wealth and you're also helping the needy as well. So I think just shifting that culture coming out of the fiat system where you're constantly incentivized to spend and waste resources into this Bitcoin thing where you're incentivized to save, that's actually a good thing. You're deferring consumption. You're not consuming now so that you can consume later. And anything that you do save, you have to pay zakat on it, which is also good. So like, it just has all of these benefits that I think perfectly like align itself with Islamic principles.
And getting back to the savings aspect, I know there's maybe Muslims who might be listening who will, quickly want to say, well, you're forgetting about gold, Well, I mean, obviously gold is the original Sunnah money. And, I think it's a great thing to save in gold. My brother and I, we have precious metals that we also save in. And, it does have its fair share of drawbacks, though. So, I like to kind of look at it from the lens of technology. And, gold is kind of the old technology, with gold being made into coins. That's kind of a primitive technology. And, it can get the job done if you're in a bind. But, like, wouldn't it be better to adopt something that has that's like gold 2.0, where, you don't have the limitations of gold, where things are like, okay, you can save in it, but can you really coordinate using gold? You need centralized institutions to be able to, scale gold to be used on a wide basis over long distances. And that kind of sets you up for the development of central banking all over again. And so, it kind of goes back to that saying, the definition of being an idiot is doing the same thing over again, but expecting different results. I think it's good to hold gold if you're holding it yourself. And, we don't want to kind of get in a situation where you're having to trust others to hold your gold for you. Because, again, that's your central point of failure, is if you're having to trust others with your wealth. With Bitcoin, you hold the private keys yourself. And there's many ways of holding private keys. I mean, you can have it on your own computer, on your phone. The smart way would be to have a a hardware wallet, or having your keys stamped in a steel plate. That's maybe a good way to kind of make sure it's made really durable. And then if you need something fancier than that, you can have a multi-sig setup where there's multiple keys distributed over many different people in many different geographies. And so, when it comes to coordination, when it comes to coordinating Muslims all over the world, I really think Bitcoin is definitely the way to go. I mean, just the ease at which you can kind of coordinate holding Bitcoin, transacting Bitcoin, it really kind of leaves, gold in the dust.
Yeah, and made a really good point about like, Muslims being able to coordinate each other. I mean, it's pretty much impossible to do that in a trustless way using gold. I mean, gold kind of, if you want to use it as a store of value, like works, but you have to keep in mind that you actually have to buy the metal and then you have to like store it somewhere very securely and it has a bunch of other issues, but really, I mean, you can't really actually use it as a medium of exchange. I mean, if I want to buy a product or a service or something, and especially if I'm buying it like from, halfway across the world, there's no way for me to like send that gold unless I introduce a third party to be able to transact on my behalf. And, with that introduction of third parties, that's always end up going to lead to banking. And, with banking, that's going to end up leading to fractional reserve banking and riba-based fiat currency. I mean, that's exactly what happened. And that was kind of like the main deficiency of gold, is that people ended up giving up custody of their gold to another institution, and that's kind of like how the institutional usury that we find ourselves in today, that's kind of how it came about. And it's like gold is just good for holding. It's not, even then it kind of sucks at that, but like you can't really actually transact with gold. So whenever like I hear people talk about gold as an alternative to Bitcoin, it's like, I mean, you can't even really compare the two, because with Bitcoin, I can just send someone like less than a penny's worth of Bitcoin, halfway across the world, and I can, settle that instantly over the Lightning Network. And like, there's nothing like comparable to like, gold or fiat or any other type of money. I mean, I think that's very powerful in that aspect.
And this is probably, you discussed it in other episodes, but when we're able to raise funds during the month of Ramadan, that's exactly what we were able to do. We coordinated with this Ugandan orphanage, and we broadcast their address to everyone on Twitter, saying let's raise funds, and what we're going to, this zakat is going to go straight to the orphanage. So we publicized the Bitcoin address to send Bitcoin to them, and over the course of a month, they received, I think it was like 0.2 Bitcoin.
Yeah. So it's
over
like,
the month.
yeah. So it's like over $6,000 or so. Yeah.
Yeah, worth of Bitcoin, and but so like what was amazing is that the funds did not pass through us. We just publicized their Bitcoin address, and the funds went straight to them. Funds for like really tiny donations, bigger donations, it went straight to them without a middleman. And that's an example of coordination happening in a global manner without having to rely on any particular centralized institution. Like, it's getting sent directly to the orphanage, and that's not something that would have been possible to do with gold. And it kind of goes back to gold is old technology. I mean, sometimes we do need old technology, but when it comes to coordinating, economic value on a global basis, Bitcoin does it 10,000 times better than gold, and it does it 1,000 times better than fiat currency, because we're not trusting banks to coordinate this. I mean, you hear stories all the time about how charities can lose access to banking, and then that just leads to the funds not getting to where it's needed over the world. But with Bitcoin, it goes straight to where it's needed.
Yeah, that's was so exciting when we did that during the month of Ramadan, because it really just it's just a small use case, and just like this small thing that we did, but like you can kind of like we have a blog post written on Bitcoin Majlis talking about this event where we raised sats for this orphanage in Uganda. But it's just really powerful because it just kind of shows that like the ability or this innate desire for Muslims to want to coordinate each other through the institution of zakat is already there. But like but the thing is that we have this fiat system that makes it really hard to coordinate zakats. And I mean, if you think about like the way in which Muslims kind of coordinate economic value globally, I mean, zakat is kind of like that bedrock that allows Muslims to like be able to help each other out. Like that's why it's a pillar of Islam. And I see Bitcoin as a way to kind of like actually like, revive that institution of zakat and like to be able to do it on a global scale. I mean, we just did this for some orphanage in Uganda, and we're still that wasn't just like a one-off thing. Like we as Bitcoin Majlis, we are still supporting this orphanage. We've kind of adopted the orphans of the orphanage, and we've been supporting them on a regular basis, alhamdulillah. And also we have a link to the donation address if you want to go visit us at bitcoinmajlis.org. So if you want to actually participate in this, we even have a guide on there where if you want to get started with Bitcoin, especially on the Lightning Network, we have a very handy guide that's a very idiot-proof guide on like just how to start transacting Bitcoin over the Lightning Network. And there's even a little link in there that will say, like, if you want some sats, we will send you sats that you can send to them. So you can just see how instantaneous and how awesome this Lightning Network technology is, which we could talk about this later. We have to talk about it now, but the Lightning Network is just this second layer that's built on top of Bitcoin to help facilitate instant payments over the Bitcoin network. So it's, being able to kind of coordinate that value among Muslims globally, I think is so powerful. And I really do think that like zakat institutions are going to be paying more attention to this technology of Bitcoin in that aspect.
Yeah, like when it comes to, Bitcoin being kind of a base protocol network for money, other layers of, payments can be built on top of it. And, Lightning is just amazing because, when it comes to the speed, it's instantaneous. And then when it comes to the cost, it's really fractions of a penny to send value all over the world to anyone else on the Lightning Network. And, it's quite amazing. And, you'll hear this, whenever you're learning about Bitcoin, you'll inevitably come across, okay, well, there's Bitcoin, then there's all these other coins too. And the other coins, the part of their marketing propaganda is how they're better than Bitcoin because they're faster and cheaper. But, with Lightning Network, it's already faster and cheaper than those other coins. So it's don't that's something that we want to educate people on, is don't get distracted by the nonsense of altcoins, because we already have like a robust payment network, and it's also using the world's best money, which is Bitcoin. If it's if you're looking at an altcoin that's really cheap and fast to send, it's probably built on a different algorithm that's not based on proof of work, which means it's something that's easy to replicate. And when it comes to comparing these networks that don't have proof of work, I mean, those are kind of systems that can be easily gamed by, malicious actors, even the people that, for example, gave themselves a huge allocations of the coins initially, that they're not fairly distributed. So you have people that have gotten unfairly wealthy. Whereas when it comes to Bitcoin, it was a completely fair launch. When Satoshi Nakamoto launched Bitcoin, it was a completely fair launch. He launched it in a way where he announced it to mailing list of cypherpunks, which would have been, the people that would have been primarily kind of interested in developing an e-money. And, he didn't mine anything when Bitcoin was released. So he didn't mine without competition. There was always other people there at the beginning that were also mining with Satoshi. So Satoshi didn't give himself special allocation of coins. All the coins that Satoshi has, like he had to mine himself. He had to put his computers to work in order to get hold of that Bitcoin. Whereas when you look at all these altcoin systems, they're insiders that just kind of print themselves huge allocations of money. And imagine, you're someone getting excited about these altcoins and like, oh wow, there's so much, quote unquote utility to these altcoins, and then they try to pump these altcoins and they'll tell their friends and family about these altcoins. But what are you doing? What's the benefit of doing that when insiders gave themselves so much of the initial supply, only to inevitably dump on everyone else that's holding that coin, because they gave themselves that coin for nothing. Like they just printed it out of nowhere. There was no energy that went into it.
Yeah, I think like, whenever there's a, company or a startup that wants to like try to recreate Bitcoin, I mean, like, one, you can't recreate digital scarcity, but like, even if you do like try to do that, you necessarily have to kind of manage the initial production and the distribution of it. And because, like, people know about it. Like when Bitcoin like first came about, it didn't even have like a dollar price or anything. It was just some nerds on a mailing list that were just like mining and trading these coins with each other. Like, it wasn't like it wasn't that there was like a startup or something that was like profiting off of this. It was like you said, it was a fair launch and a fair distribution.
And yeah, also made it kind of a unique situation that cannot be replicated is that, the Bitcoins did not have any value at that time. The people were just kind of like, mining for fun and sending these coins to each other because it was, quite the novel thing to be able to kind of do that kind of thing. But people had no clue that, Bitcoin was going to become valuable in the future. And so that allowed a distribution of like coins to just go into many hands in a fair way. I mean, you had plenty of faucets in the early days where people were able to get, coins distributed to them by people who were, being very generous, and people were, trading these things, for under $1. So that kind of, led to distribution. And then when people, maybe complain about wealth in Bitcoin being too concentrated because there's not that many people that are using Bitcoin today. I mean, well, I think there's quite a few, like there's millions and millions of people that are using Bitcoin, but an altcoin is not going to be the solution to fair distribution, because these altcoins always have a less fair distribution of their coins. So if the goal is to kind of get a more fair distribution, you're not going to get it with altcoins. It's really Bitcoin or nothing. I mean, like the way we see it is, it's Bitcoin versus the dollar at this point. And, we feel that, when it comes to what aligns Islamically, it's really Bitcoin that does, because it's not based on debt. It's not based on any usury. It's just money that does not require debt.
Yeah, I think, you talked about it earlier, like a lot of these altcoiners will, focus so much on different utilities, like, like generating yield, which ironically is not even a utility by definition, but like, they'll try to like focus on all of these different utilities, but they completely miss like what like the problem that Bitcoin is trying to solve, which is the central control and the manipulation of money. And so that's what Bitcoin is trying to be, is just like an actual money. And I feel like that's just it's just kind of like lost on a lot of people that are into like that crypto space. I mean, I had this conversation with someone that was like into Web3, and like it's just like we speak like really different. Bitcoiners and altcoiners speak like such different languages. Like I was trying to explain to this guy like what time preference was, and he didn't even know like what Austrian economics is, because like they focus so much on the technical aspect of it and don't even bother like focusing on like what the economic issue is, or like what the problem in money actually is. And that's they don't actually look at Bitcoin as trying to solve from that aspect. And like there's no point in trying to build a global financial system on any of these other altcoins, because it just doesn't have any liquidity. And like that's Bitcoin trying to be money. Like it has its value emerging like within it. Like there's not, whenever you're trying to like bootstrap all of these utilities on an altcoin, it's just like you're kind of admitting that, oh, this thing is worthless unless we put these other utilities and tack it on to this whatever altcoin project is. So I think like from that aspect, you realize that like Bitcoin is trying to be money, and it's an extremely valuable utility.
Yeah, when it comes to tokens, there's not anything with more utility that can be achieved than other than being money. And Bitcoin has there is no second best when it comes to what's a good form of money. And it really is Bitcoin that I think is going to be the money, inshallah. We kind of want to see a change in the world. We both have children, and we want them to live in a future where they're not shackled down by the riba system. When it's something that kind of people maybe don't realize is they'll be proud of the fact that they're not partaking in any riba. They're not taking out loans and things like that. And they say, look, I'm just holding cash and I'm not partaking in any riba. However, it still props up the riba-based system when you're holding cash. And people have to ask themselves, okay, when you're holding cash, like pull out the cash from your wallet and see what it says. What is a dollar? A dollar, it says on there, it's a Federal Reserve note. And so that should, beg the question, okay, what does the Federal Reserve hold in reserves? And if you take a look, study it, it's something that they advertise what they hold in reserve. What they hold in reserves are bonds. And that's kind of the basis of how the dollar works. Your dollar is backed up by bonds. And, if Muslims wouldn't put their wealth by investing into bonds, I don't see how it's much different to be holding dollars that are ultimately also backed by bonds. So realistically, we're still going to be stuck in some aspect of having to use fiat for everyday things. But just imagine how much power you take away from the fiat system when you have your savings in an alternative system that's outside of the fiat rails, that's outside of the control of the banking system, and you have full control of it now. And that's kind of how things should be. That is what leads to fairer markets. That's what leads to freer trade. Then that is what leads to freer economic coordination among Muslims.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the way I like to frame it to Muslims is that, there's this riba problem that's in fiat, and the only solution realistically is Bitcoin. I just don't see it. It's not going to be any other altcoin. It's not going to be gold. It's not going to be any other thing. I think we have to try our best to move off of this riba-based system, this fiat system where riba is at the base layer of this protocol, to move off of, and we need to move off of it into this Bitcoin protocol where there's no riba at the base layer, and it even exhibits these anti-riba properties, which we can get into in a future episode, inshallah. But I think this was a really good first episode to just kind of highlight what our views are when we kind of started Bitcoin Majlis, and what kind of the Bitcoin only approach is, and that what that means going forward for Muslims adopting a Bitcoin standard. So inshallah we'll continue this in another episode, but for right now we'll see you until next time, inshallah. All right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone.